Hey all, welcome to the show. I'm your host Austin. Today we'll talk about going back to the basics of what is whiskey. And I review a bourbon, a scotch, and a beer. No, I'm just kidding. A bourbon, scotch, and Japanese whiskey. Let's get started. Alright guys, so the most common question I get from people is, what is the difference between bourbon and whiskey? And what is the difference between scotch and whiskey? So I decided I'm going to go over the basics. Start at the basics, go from there. And if you want more detail on this, I'll tell you right now, and I'll probably remind you again later, I actually have an ebook on my website, linked below, if you want to check that out. That goes into way more detail of what is whiskey, where is whiskey, how is whiskey made, and then how to taste whiskey like a pro, and then other ways to drink and explore your different whiskeys, if you're going down this nerdy rabbit hole that I've gone down. So check that out. Also have a course coming out here soon, so keep an eye out on that. Alright, let's get rolling. So, to answer your question from above, bourbon is whiskey. All bourbon is whiskey. All scotch is whiskey. Whiskey is an overarching category that these fall into. So, what is whiskey? I'm going to read this for you. The legal definition of whiskey varies from country to country. In the United States, whiskey is a distilled spirit made from fermented grain mash and aged in wooden containers. Whiskey must be bottled at least 80 proof, 40% alcohol by volume. In the European Union, whiskey is defined as a distilled spirit made from fermented grain mash and aged in wooden containers, usually for at least 3 years. The minimum age for whiskey is 3 years, but most whiskeys are aged for longer. Whiskeys must be bottled at a minimum of 37.5% alcohol by volume. I've never seen that before. That's from the internet, people. And then Japan recently came out with a law, very similar, distilled spirit made from fermented grain mash, aged in wooden containers, and usually has that 3-year mark as well. They actually got stricter for Japanese whiskey. To have that label Japanese whiskey, everything must be grown in Japan. Water must be from Japan, distilled in Japan, aged in Japan, bottled in Japan. Similar to scotch, right? So let's look at some countries that make whiskey. In general, we see Scotland, Ireland, Canada, Japan, of course the US. So just a real quick overview of each of these, and we'll go into more details of whiskey types here later. So Scotland is usually known for its single malt. It also has some good blended malt. That word malt means 100% malted barley. The word single or blend. Single means all the distillate comes from a single distillery. Blend comes from multiple distilleries. So if it's a single grain, it's not 100% malted barley, but it is 100% from a single distillery. Ireland, similar connotation. Generally, it's a pot stilled, and it's a blend of malted and unmalted barley in the mash bill. Gives it kind of a more sugar cookie flavor is kind of what's common in Irish whiskey. Canada is known for its rye. Usually a rye mash, usually 51% rye grain. Typically aged in new charred oak, but not always. Canada is very lax on their whiskey laws for Canadian whiskey. A lot of things can be called Canadian whiskey. Japan, we kind of already talked about. They tend to copy Scotland, and they like the single malt. Usually it's a little bit lighter flavor. Scotland's got your different ranges from light flavors to smoky, peaty flavors, depending on your region, depending on your distillery. Japan, similar to that, but they tend to stick to more of the lighter, sweeter flavors. And then the U.S., you have bourbon, you have rye. Bourbon is a predominantly corn whiskey. Rye is predominantly rye. So, speaking of that, if you want more details on these types, please go check out my book and check out my course. Go into detail for each one. We're going to jump into details for the most common here. So we got bourbon, the scotch. So for bourbon, bourbon must be at least a mash bill of 51% corn. Usually it's a lot higher than that. Must be aged in new charred oak containers. Not necessarily a barrel, but a container. But it's got to be new. It hasn't been used for anything else and charred. There's no age limit on that. You can be in there for 5 seconds and bottle it and be considered bourbon. There's other laws guiding the age. If you see straight bourbon, you know it's a certain age. Bottle and bond, you know it's a certain age. You see an age statement, you know it's a certain age. But just to be called bourbon does not need that age statement. Must be distilled at no more than 160 proof or 80% alcohol by volume as it exits the still. And it can't be put into a barrel any higher than 125 proof. That's unique. Usually 90% alcohol is your limit for off the still for a whiskey. it's dropped down to 80 for bourbon, and then you have a proof of what you can go into the barrel. So you have to, if you do distill it at 80% alcohol, you have to proof it down to 62.5% or less to put in the barrel. A lot of times they go less. I think Wild Turkey's puts it in at 110 proof. And then it must be bottled at no less than 80 proof, just like any other whiskey in the U.S. Now looking at rye, the other common U.S. spirit, almost exact same requirements as bourbon, but the only difference is the mash bill must be 51% rye rather than 51% corn. And that's in the U.S. As long as it has that 51% rye, other parts of the world it can be considered rye, I believe. So that's where we're at with the U.S. rye. And Scotch is a whole different thing. It's one of the strictest laws. Bourbon, I think, is the strictest. Scotch is the second. So Scotch, as of 2009, they defined Scotch whiskey as must be produced in Scotland from water and malted barley or other cereals with malted barley in them, all from Scotland. This is distilled generally in a pot still, but it can be a column still. It's matured in an oak cask for at least 3 years, so it's usually used oak. It's usually used bourbon, or can be used port barrels, sherry barrels, different things like that. Multiple and blended together. That's not strict like bourbon is, but it has to be oak, and it has to be at least 3 years. And then bottled at least 40%. It must be produced and bottled in Scotland to be considered Scotch. So you can't just buy a barrel and bottle it in the U.S. and call it Scotch. That's the kicker there. So that's our basics here for whiskey. What is whiskey? I'm going to give some review and tasting notes for 3 different whiskeys: a Japanese whiskey, a Scotch, and a bourbon. That will kind of give you some general tasting notes. I picked these because I think they're a good representation of their category. Get some common tasting notes for these types of whiskeys. So check that out. I have an ebook that goes into a lot of detail about this stuff. A lot more detail. I have a course coming that will go even more detail. It'll be in different segments where I'll be leading it. I'll give you a list of whiskey bottles that are readily available if you want to get them and taste along with the class. It'll be a lot of fun. But I also have a merch store. I got some really cool t-shirts that are actually coming in. I should be wearing one right now. T-shirts, hats, pint glasses. I'm working on getting whiskey glasses, but check that out at Bourboneering.com. Check that out below. And if you're watching on YouTube, welcome. Please subscribe and like this video. If you're not, if you're listening, please give us a review wherever you're listening. And come think about checking out the YouTube channel. It's Bourboneering Podcast. That's the channel. I also have Bourboneering Media, which will be the more fun videos, kind of taste test, bracket challenges, things like that. So without further ado, let's get started. So we are going to be starting with our Scotch because it's the lowest proof at 40%. This is Highland Park Magnus. This is from the Highland Park Distillery, which is a Highland single malt, I do believe. Orkney Island, Scotland, yeah. Let's see. I see Piper the Bourbon Dog back there looking at something. Hey, Piper. All right. Cool little bottle. I like the Highland Park all dark blacked out bottle. So on the nose, a little bit of a smoke just right off the bat. Saltiness, I guess, is more of a term. Not really peat, but some good salty brininess. This is common in Scotch, especially in Islay. It's going to have a lot of smoke and peat. Anything around islands or the coast is going to have a little bit of salt water kind of flavor there. A lot of fresh red apple. Maybe some apple skin. Sweet. That apple juice, red apple juice, sweeter apple, biting into a fresh apple. That's the biggest note I get there. A little bit cereal grainy, but then that kick of salt and spice, almost like a salted caramel, in the sense that it kind of refreshes your palate once you go back for another sip. Just in the background. Sweet. I love that. Desserty. Yeah, okay, medium finish. Real light, real sweet. Easy drinker, pretty cheap. I believe this bottle's around $30. Let me at Total Wine is $46.99. So it's kind of gone up a little bit, but it is what it is. Good value. It's going to be a cheaper Scotch if we're going to be honest here. Going to be a little bit cheaper, but for a single malt, still pretty good. You know, I'm going to give it an overall score out of 5. I'm going to give it a 3. Give it a nice 3. It's above average. I enjoy it. I keep a bottle on the shelf as kind of a go-to easy single malt Scotch. Alright, I'm going to take a little break, reset here, and we'll get to our Hibiki. 2 or 3 whiskey show, but let's get after it. We're going with Japanese whiskey here. Another good example of just a classic Japanese whiskey, or classic whiskey of its category. It's going to be Hibiki Harmony. I don't know if you can read that. Beautiful bottle, by the way. I went ahead and looked up the price ahead of time, so you're not waiting on me. It's around $95, $98. So I'd say right at $100 after tax. So it's not a cheap pour, I'll tell you that. So I got this as a gift, and I'm very thankful for it. Alright, let's give it a nosing, shall we? A lot more wood influence, maybe some port influence than the Scotch. A more rich sweetness, maybe like a brown sugar sweetness or a port sweetness. No peatiness, no saltiness here at all. Very sweet, but again, rich. It kind of balances out more in the richness than it does in the saltiness. Some bourbon barrel influence. Very bourbony. A little bit of brown sugar. That maltiness is still strong, but just look at the color of this. Way darker than our last one. I love these little wee glens, by the way. A lot richer on the mouthfeel. I say rich a lot. Thick mouthfeel. Let's see what the finish is. Orange oil. I get orange oil a lot on these rich, thicker whiskeys. I never picture this one being viscous, but compared to the Highland Park, it definitely is. It's delicious, bro. Value is not there, though, to give it a high score. The value at $100 is not there, in my opinion. I'm going to have to give it a 2.8, and that's on the value alone. Ignoring the value, this is 3.5 for delicious whiskey, but to me, being a bourbon guy, I'm not willing to pay $100 for this again. If someone wants to give it to me as a gift, I appreciate it. It is delicious. I will take it every time. A fantastic whiskey, but to me, not worth $100. All right, one more quick break, and we'll get to our bourbon. A little bit, if you can't tell. My favorite category, bourbon. Listen to Piper just drinking up at the storm right now. That's what it's like living with a dog. All right, this is Old Tub. This is a wheated bourbon. I don't know if it's wheated. Bottle and bond bourbon from Jim Beam. Cheap. Used to be distillery only. It's like $23 a bottle. I got these on a clearance sale. So it was like $10 a bottle. 100 proof. I mean, it's bottle and bond. We'll talk about that in a later episode. But it's got at least 4 years old, at least 100 proof. Alright, exactly 100 proof. Got that Jim Beam nuttiness all over it. That's what I love about bourbon. It's just fun. Way more, to me, not as nuanced as Scotch, but way more layers. Nuttiness, peanut butter, brown sugar, maybe a little bit of salt in there. Not like a Scotch saltiness, but a salted caramel maybe. Ever had a peanut butter banana sandwich? That's what that tastes like. And that is a bourbon. That is not a flavored whiskey. It's a bourbon. That is a $23 bourbon. $24 bourbon. Wow. It's delicious. That's fun. It's fun at that price point. Now, I wouldn't pay more than $50, $60 for this, but it shoots way above $24 for what it is. I have 4 or 5 bottles of this because they were going on clearance at this one store, so I grabbed them all. Grabbed what I could. Finish is a little short, lingering, got that banana, got that oak, but it is what it is. Great old-fashioned maker, great to sip neat, great to sip on the rocks, got a proof, especially for this hot season we're in now in South Louisiana, but I'm giving that a 4 out of 5, and that's highly placed on the high value ranking there, but I'm giving it a 4 out of 5. That's my ranking. That's what I got, y'all, for today. I appreciate you hanging out. If you've been here, go check out Bourboneering.com. I got reviews on there at the blog. Got a store with some t-shirts, some glassware, my ebook, eventually my course. So, check it out. Let me know what you think. Cheers.